Evil has a transcendent nature. That's the first thing that we need to get out of this passage. I think that's where we have to start. Verse 12, it says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." And I think this is the baseline of the issue. We must remember, we must realize who the real enemy is. Paul says we don't wrestle with flesh and blood. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that flesh and blood isn't part of the struggle. Clearly, flesh and blood is part of the struggle. I mean, Paul, after all, was whipped. Paul was stoned. Paul was imprisoned by flesh and blood people, real people. So Paul certainly wrestled with flesh and blood, and we certainly wrestle with flesh and blood. But what Paul is saying here is that all of that is only the surface discussion. We don't wrestle only with flesh and blood. There is something deeper than the physical confrontation that you and I experience on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, the flesh and blood arrayed against you might not even know that it is being used by forces beyond themselves. And that really ought to change how you think and how we react and how to the people around us, to the tangible conflicts that we get into. So when you look out in the world and you see war, or you see poverty, or you see injustice, you see all the terrible things that are happening out there, Paul says there's something underlying all of that which is beyond the natural. Now, I've read, and you probably have too, a lot of accounts from people in World War II that freed the concentration camps, or other people that have witnessed genocide in firsthand, and they saw the effects. And universally, across the board, they always say something like, "I was shocked that people were capable of doing something like that to another person." And what Paul is showing you is that this isn't just a person acting. There is something driving those things, something insidious, something malevolent that is doing that. The humanity that's taking part in it is basically a humanity that ultimately has no defense against evil, which is why it's so susceptible to it. And so we must be aware, we must be more aware of evil than our culture is if we're going to do anything about it. We need to be more prepared than the average person in our age of science today. Why? Because, well, science says everything has a natural cause. And so we find Paul in an extreme juxtaposition to what our scientific world says. The science says, oh, there's only a natural cause. If there's evil, whatever you want to call that, well, that's the result of unjust social systems, or it's the result of bad parenting, or it's just bad brain chemistry. Evil has to have some biological or psychological or sociological cause, or some combination of any of those in order for it to exist. And what ultimately science is saying then is that those things are natural. And since those things are natural, they are ultimately controllable. Which means the scientific world believes the opposite of what Paul says in this passage. Science says we only wrestle with flesh and blood. Only. That's it. That's all there is. There's nothing else out there. However horrendous the evil is, it's something that we could control if we could just fix the family systems, or fix the social systems, or fix the chemical systems, or fix the neurological systems. But at the same time, even though science is growing by leaps and bounds, and we've got advances and breakthroughs that make things possible today, for instance, C. Trey Miller, that weren't possible even 25 years ago, even though science is discovering all these things about sociology and biology and chemistry and the psychology of the human mind, doesn't it feel like things are moving in the opposite direction all around us? Science is getting more answers than ever, and yet our culture seems like it's experimenting more and more with evil. Evil is real. I mean, Lauren and I were just talking this past week. Maybe you heard the headlines or saw the headlines. There was a boy in Indiana that murdered 6 family members. Why? Because his parents said he couldn't sleep at his girlfriend's house. So he killed them all. You can't just chalk that up to bad parenting, because if you chalk that up to bad parenting, well, you've missed the root cause of all of this. It avoids the issue if you say, well, it's just if their parents had done better. What has happened is that we've thrown away all of the intellectual, all of the spiritual resources that we have to deal with evil, because we believed in a fallacy that says, well, the physical is all that exists. And we call that intellectualism. But we who live in the shadow of Columbine, we can see the results of this. It's very apparent to us. 26 years ago, shootings at schools were so rare that practically every member of the media showed up. You couldn't get into Clement Park. You remember if you were here. You couldn't get into Clement Park because there were so many news vans parked in the parking lots. It was inaccessible to you. Today, a shooting happens, and it might be in the news cycle, but if it is, it's only there for about 48 hours, and then it's gone. The mayhem that goes on today hardly even gets reported. And if it does get reported, it's all from a political motivation. See what they're allowing, see what they're causing. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, it's used that way. So I ask you this question is, how is the battle with flesh and blood going if it's all flesh and blood and it's all manageable? Way back in 1995, 95, can you believe that? That was a long time ago. No, it wasn't. Andrew Delbanco, who is a self-described secular liberal from Columbia University, still teaches there, wrote a book. Pre-Columbine, he wrote this book. And this book was called The Death of Satan. Now, he's a liberal, not a Christian as far as I'm aware. But it got a lot of attention back then, although I don't think it was ever mentioned in the coverage of Columbine. His first sentence was, "A gulf has opened up in our culture between the visibility of evil and the intellectual resources available for coping with it." Interesting premise. He says the evil that was always there is still there. Nothing has changed. But we have attempted to get rid of the idea of evil within the heart. Sin, he says. You're not allowed to call somebody a sinner anymore. How could you say something horrid like that? That would be like calling people garbage. And so we got rid of the idea of sin, we got rid of evil within the heart, but we also got rid of the idea of supernatural evil, the devil. And now we're absolutely astounded that there is something beyond what we can manage and control, because we have no way to cope with it if it's not manageable. Do you remember the movie The Silence of the Lambs? That was about the same time that Andrew Delbanco wrote this book. Silence of the Lambs was in the theaters. I remember seeing it 3 times because it freaked me out, and the only way I could deal with it psychologically was to see it again, if that makes any sense. But the premise of this is that there's this officer Starling, right? And she's young and fresh and naive, and she's meeting with Hannibal Lecter, which is this horrid person. And she struggles with what could cause Hannibal Lecter to be so evil. She can't grasp it, right? She can't deal with it, even though she's been scientifically trained. But Scripture can. Paul says here, there is supernatural evil that brings out evil physically in our flesh and blood world. Now, I'm not going to try to prove that to you right here. We don't have time. You guys want to go watch a Bronco game. I get it. But even if you disagree with that premise, you still have the same burden of proof that I'm not going to do here. You've got to be able to prove that there is no supernatural evil in the world. You've got to come up with a different narrative for evil. See, the secular view of the world is under the same obligation as the Christian view on this subject, and it is completely unable to deal with it. Now they say, well, that's because we haven't had enough time. Just give us more time and we'll figure it out. Will we? And Paul would say, if you don't understand that you don't just battle against flesh and blood, if you don't understand that we battle with forces beyond flesh and blood, you will never actually deal with the root of the issue, which means that you will never figure it out by looking at flesh and blood. You can't. See, the Bible has a paradigm that can account for what we see in our culture. It can account for slaughter. It can account for Hannibal Lecter. Because evil is both natural and supernatural. It's inside and it's outside. That's called transcendence. But our mundane theories of manageability and controllability of evil have left us 21st century people absolutely defenseless. We can't figure it out. And so we have nothing but shock. We can be nothing but appalled when we see it. And then there's only so much emotion that we can give to it. And eventually we become desensitized to it.